September 20th, 1929. The date means nothing to most people today. But on that Friday afternoon, in a nondescript government office in London, a financial bomb detonated that would ultimately destroy more wealth than every war in human history combined. A bomb that would send shockwaves across the Atlantic Ocean and transform the wealthiest nation on Earth into a graveyard of shuttered factories, bread lines, and broken dreams. The man who lit the fuse was not a terrorist. He was not a revolutionary. He was a 37-year-old silk merchant's son named Clarence Charles Hatry, and on that September day, he walked voluntarily into the office of Sir Archibald Bodkin, Britain's Director of Public Prosecutions, and confessed to fraud on a scale that would make Bernie Madoff look like a petty shoplifter. Within hours, the London Stock Exchange went into free fall. Within weeks, Wall Street followed. Within 4 years, 13 million Americans would be unemployed, 9,000 banks would collapse, and the global economic order would be shattered so completely that it would take a world war to put it back together. This is the story of how one man's desperate gamble to save his financial empire accidentally triggered the worst economic catastrophe in modern history. To understand how Clarence Hatry broke the world, you first need to understand the world he lived in. The 1920s were not called the Roaring Twenties as a joke. America was drunk on prosperity. The Great War was over. Europe lay in ruins, but America had emerged as the world's creditor, its banker, its manufacturer. Per capita income had risen 31% since 1919. The economy had grown 42% in a decade. Factory production had increased 84%. Every metric pointed skyward. And nowhere was this euphoria more intoxicating than on Wall Street. The Dow Jones Industrial Average had climbed from 63 points in August 1921 to 381 points by September 1929, a six-fold increase. The stock market had become a casino where everyone was winning. Your cab driver was buying stocks. Your housekeeper was buying stocks. Clerks and cooks and chauffeurs were mortgaging their homes to buy stocks, because stocks only went up. Everyone knew this. It was a law of nature, like gravity, except gravity worked in reverse. The mechanism that turned sensible investing into collective insanity was called buying on margin. Here's how it worked. You wanted to buy $1,000 worth of General Motors stock. Under the loose rules of the time, you only needed to put down 10%, $100. The brokerage firm would lend you the other $900. If the stock went up, you made money on the full $1,000 investment while only risking $100. It was alchemy. It was free money. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Because leverage is a sword that cuts both ways. If your stock went down, you didn't just lose your $100. The broker would demand more cash immediately to cover the declining value of the collateral. This was called a margin call. If you couldn't pay, they would sell your stock at whatever price they could get, often locking in catastrophic losses. By the summer of 1929, over $8.5 billion was out on loan for stock purchases. This was more than the entire money supply of the United States. The entire market had become a house of cards built on borrowed money, held together by nothing more substantial than the collective belief that prices would keep rising forever. But 3,000 miles away, in London, a very different drama was unfolding. A drama that would shatter that belief and send the house of cards tumbling down. Clarence Hatry was not your typical British financier. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith would later describe him as one of those curiously un-English figures with whom the English periodically find themselves unable to cope. The son of a Jewish silk merchant, Hatry had been bankrupt by age 25, but he had a gift. He was a brilliant manipulator, a world-class networker, a man who could sell ice to Eskimos and make them believe they were getting a bargain. He rebuilt his fortune by speculating in oil stocks and promoting industrial conglomerates. He engineered the merger of London's bus companies. He started a photo booth business called Photomaton that installed cameras in railway stations across Britain. He launched investment trusts and brokerage firms. By 1929, the Hatry Group of companies was worth £24 million, the equivalent of nearly £2 billion in today's money. Hatry lived like a king. He owned Westward, once the largest yacht in British waters. He was known for diving from her bowsprit. His Mayfair mansion featured a swimming pool on the principal bedroom floor and a Tudor-style cocktail bar in the basement that he called Ye Olde Stanhope Arms-Free House. He swam in his pool every morning, year-round, despite being described by contemporaries as a sallow, baldish, unhealthy-looking little man. His office suite had ornate bathrooms. He maintained racing stables. He spent £70,000 renovating his home. For a man whose father had sold silk, this was the height of ambition realized. He was living proof that in the new modern economy, anyone could become wealthy beyond imagination. But beneath the veneer of success, Hatry was drowning. His photo booth company, Photomaton, was hemorrhaging money. He had invested heavily in trying to prop it up, throwing good money after bad. And then, in the spring of 1929, he conceived of his masterpiece, the deal that would save everything. He would consolidate the British steel industry. He would buy United Steel for $40 million and use it as a platform to snap up smaller companies and create an industrial titan. It was bold. It was visionary. And it might have worked. Except in June, his backers got cold feet. The Labour government had just won the election, and the bankers who had promised to finance the deal suddenly pulled out. Hatry found himself committed to a massive acquisition with no way to pay for it. He scrambled. He went from bank to bank, begging for bridge loans. In late August, he even made a secret visit to the Bank of England to appeal directly to its governor, Montague Norman. Norman, who by all accounts was something of a snob, took one look at the sweating silk merchant's son and refused him. Norman told him flatly that he had paid too much for United Steel and that the bank would not help. This was the moment when Clarence Hatry made the decision that would change history. Faced with the collapse of his empire, faced with the loss of everything he had built, he decided to commit fraud. Not sophisticated fraud, not elaborate fraud, petty, desperate, stupid fraud. He began forging municipal bonds. Through his brokerage firm, Corporation and General Securities, he was supposed to be issuing bonds for British towns and cities, legitimate bonds that would be sold to investors to fund public projects. But Hatry started printing fake bonds. He forged City of Wakefield municipal bonds and used them as collateral to secure loans. He raised £750,000 this way, though only £450,000 worth of genuine bonds were ever delivered to the city of Wakefield. The other $300,000 simply didn't exist. They were pieces of paper with fancy printing and official-looking seals, backed by nothing but Hatry's desperation. But even that wasn't enough. He went further. He began duplicating share certificates from his own companies. The same certificates were printed 2, 3 times and given as security to different banks. It was the financial equivalent of selling the same house to 3 different buyers and hoping they never compared notes. For a few months, it worked. The money kept flowing. The steel deal moved forward. Hatry believed he could pull it off, that once the merger was complete and the profits started rolling in, he could quietly pay back the fraudulent loans, and no one would be the wiser. He told himself he was not a criminal. He was just a businessman, doing what was necessary to survive, to protect his employees, to fulfill his vision. But fraud has a funny way of revealing itself. An alert clerk at one of the banks noticed something odd about a bearer certificate for City of Wakefield stock. The serial numbers didn't match. Questions were asked. By September 17th, Hatry's stock had started falling on the London Exchange. Rumors were circulating. His remaining creditors began calling in their loans. On September 18th, Hatry called his accountant, Sir Gilbert Garnsey, and confessed everything. Garnsey immediately contacted the authorities. On the afternoon of September 20th, Hatry and three of his associates voluntarily walked into the office of the Director of Public Prosecutions and laid out the full extent of their crimes. After confessing, the four men went to lunch at the Charing Cross Hotel, a final meal as free men. Then they were arrested and taken into custody. By Monday morning, The Times was reporting on the Hatry crisis and warning that the total losses would be very heavy. The immediate impact on the London Stock Exchange was catastrophic. When trading opened on Monday, September 23rd, every company in the Hatry Group was suspended. These included Corporation and General Securities, Photomaton Parent Corporation, the Automatic Machine Corporation, Retail Trade Securities, and the Oak Investment Corporation. Together, these companies had lost $40 million in value, equivalent to $143 million in liabilities, of which $67.5 million was irretrievably lost. The Financial Times Ordinary Share Index dropped 6% in the following days. Investors who had lost money in the Hatry collapse began frantically selling their American stocks to cover their London losses. But the real damage was not financial. It was psychological. The Hatry scandal shattered something far more important than share prices. It shattered confidence. For the past decade, small investors, ordinary people who had never invested before, had been pouring into the stock markets. The small man, as one newspaper called him, had discovered the stock exchange. These new investors did not have the experience or the sophistication of institutional players. They bought on emotion. They bought on optimism. And when that optimism was betrayed, when they saw that even the biggest names could be frauds, that even companies worth millions could be built on forged paper, they panicked. As one commentator wrote in The Spectator the week after the scandal broke, "Nothing has been more remarkable in commercial and industrial finance since the war than the vast expansion of the investing public. We shall best appreciate the true gravity of the collapse in the Hatry Group of companies if we consider it less from the point of view of money losses, which are undoubtedly repairable, than from that of future relations between the stock exchange and the new type of investors." The collapse of confidence that began in London rippled across the Atlantic like a tidal wave. American investors, who had been conditioned to view the stock market as an infallible money-printing machine, suddenly began to question everything. If a £24 million empire could be exposed as a fraud overnight, what else was built on lies? What other companies were house of cards, waiting to collapse? The selling began slowly in late September. Just a wobble. Just a correction. Nothing to worry about. On September 23rd, the week after Hatry's arrest, the New York market declined, but analysts reassured the public that this was merely a healthy adjustment after 9 years of uninterrupted growth. On October 3rd, Philip Snowden, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, called the American stock market a speculative orgy. American newspapers agreed. The stage was set. On October 23rd, the selling accelerated. The ticker tape, which printed out stock prices on a mechanical ribbon, began running 2 hours late because there were so many transactions. Panic was spreading. On October 24th, Black Thursday, the market opened with a wave of sell orders so massive that it threatened to overwhelm the entire system. 12.9 million shares changed hands. By 11:30 in the morning, the Dow had lost 11% of its value. Brokers were calling in margin loans. Investors who had borrowed 90% of their stock purchases now faced demands for immediate cash payment. Those who couldn't pay were liquidated, their stocks sold at fire sale prices, which drove the market down further, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling. It was a death spiral. A group of major bankers, led by figures like J.P. Morgan, attempted to halt the collapse. They pooled their resources and began buying stocks at above-market prices, trying to restore confidence. For a brief moment, it worked. The market stabilized. There was even a small rally. People breathed a sigh of relief. Perhaps the worst was over. But on Tuesday, October 29th, the bottom fell out. Black Tuesday. 16 million shares were traded, a volume so staggering that it would not be exceeded for nearly 40 years. The Dow lost 12% of its value in a single day. Fortunes evaporated. Men who had been millionaires in the morning were bankrupt by the afternoon. There are famous, possibly apocryphal stories of brokers and investors jumping out of office windows, though in truth, most of the victims of the crash died more slowly. Their ruins spread out over years of unemployment and despair rather than condensed into a single dramatic moment. Between September and November of 1929, stock prices fell 33%. But that was just the beginning. The market would continue to slide until July of 1932, by which time it had lost 90% of its peak value. The Dow would not return to its September 1929 high until November of 1954, a quarter century later. But did Clarence Hatry really cause all of this? Did one man's fraud in London truly trigger the complete collapse of the American and global economies? The truth is more complex. Historians and economists remain divided. Some argue that Hatry was merely the match that lit the fuse, but that the bomb was already built. The American economy had deep structural problems. Agricultural prices had been depressed for years. Farmers were drowning in debt. Consumer spending was stagnant despite the apparent prosperity. The wealth gap was enormous, with 5% of Americans controlling 33% of the income. The financial system was riddled with excessive leverage and speculation. Banks were using depositors' money to gamble on stocks without their knowledge or consent. The Federal Reserve had raised interest rates in August, cooling the economy just as it approached its most vulnerable point. Protectionist trade policies were already strangling international commerce. In this view, the crash was inevitable. If Hatry had not triggered it in September, something else would have triggered it in October, or November, or December. The economy was a bubble waiting to burst, and bubbles always burst eventually. Hatry was not the cause. He was merely the unfortunate soul who happened to be standing in the wrong place when the edifice finally came down. But other historians, including John Kenneth Galbraith in his seminal book The Great Crash of 1929, argue that timing matters enormously. The Hatry scandal specifically undermined confidence among the new class of small investors at the precise moment when the market was most psychologically fragile. These investors were not sophisticated. They did not understand financial statements or economic fundamentals. They invested based on emotion and crowd behavior. The Hatry scandal told them, in the starkest possible terms, that the game was rigged, that the people running the financial system were not trustworthy, that fraud existed at the highest levels. This psychological blow, coming exactly when it did, transformed what might have been a normal correction into a full-scale panic. Moreover, the Hatry collapse forced British investors to liquidate their American holdings to cover their London losses. This created immediate selling pressure on Wall Street at the exact moment when the market could least afford it. Some estimates suggest that foreign selling, much of it triggered by Hatry, contributed 10 to 15% of the initial American market decline. In a system as interconnected and fragile as the global financial markets of 1929, that difference between a normal correction and a catastrophic crash. Regardless of whether Hatry caused the crash or merely accelerated it, there is no question about what happened next. The stock market crash destroyed wealth, but it was the cascade of bank failures that transformed a financial crisis into the Great Depression. Banks in the 1920s operated without the protections we take for granted today. There was no deposit insurance. If your bank failed, your life savings simply vanished. And when the stock market crashed, banks that had gambled with depositors' money suddenly found themselves insolvent. In 1930, 1,352 banks failed, holding more than $853 million in deposits. In 1931, 2,294 banks failed, with nearly $1.7 billion in deposits. People who had their money in these banks lost everything. The bank failures created a vicious cycle. As banks collapsed, people rushed to withdraw their money from any bank that was still standing, creating bank runs that forced even healthy banks to close. As banks closed, credit dried up. Businesses could not get loans. Consumers stopped spending. Factories shut down. Workers were laid off. By 1933, unemployment in America had reached 25%. 1 out of every 4 people who wanted to work could not find a job. Industrial production had fallen 47%. Gross domestic product had declined 30%. Nearly 1/3 of farmers had lost their land. 9,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks had gone out of business. The suffering was almost incomprehensible. Families who had been middle class found themselves standing in bread lines. Men sold apples on street corners for pennies. Shanty towns made of scrap wood and cardboard, mockingly called Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, sprang up in every major city. The price of eggs fell from 50 cents a dozen to 13 cents, yet millions went hungry because even at 13 cents they had no money to buy them. Children went without shoes. Families were evicted from their homes. The suicide rate soared. The Depression was not limited to America. Because the United States had become the world's banker during the 1920s, lending vast sums to rebuild Europe after the war, the American collapse pulled down economies around the globe. Germany, which depended heavily on American loans, saw unemployment rise to nearly 30%. This economic devastation created the political conditions that allowed Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party to rise to power. In Britain, massive protests erupted against unemployment and poverty. In Chile, which depended on copper and nitrate exports, GDP fell by more than half. The Depression was truly global, and it would last for more than a decade. As for Clarence Hatry, he went on trial in December of 1929, along with 3 of his associates. The trial was held at the Old Bailey. Hatry's friends raised $95,000 for his defense. Standing in the dock, his voice shaking with emotion, Hatry insisted he had not meant to defraud anyone. "When I saw that matters were getting serious," he said, "I pledged every penny I possessed, my reputation, and maybe my liberty to avert what I knew would otherwise be a terrible crash." The judge was not impressed. He told Hatry that he could not imagine a worse crime. Hatry was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 9. While in prison, he worked in the library. After his release in 1938, with Europe on the brink of another war, Hatry bought into Hatchard's bookstore in Piccadilly, which is the oldest bookstore in London. He discovered that many of its customers, members of the British elite who had rejected him, were essentially using the store as a free library, borrowing books and never paying for them. Hatry threatened to post their names and debts in the bookstore window. This unique debt collection method worked. The customers paid their bills, the bookstore prospered, and Hatry got his revenge against the establishment that had never fully accepted him. He died in 1965 at the age of 76. By then, the world he had helped to destroy had been rebuilt, though it looked very different. The Great Depression had led to fundamental reforms in the financial system. The United States created the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate the stock market, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure bank deposits, ensuring that no one would ever again lose their life savings because of a bank failure. The Banking Act of 1933, known as the Glass-Steagall Act, separated commercial banking from investment banking, trying to prevent the conflicts of interest that had fueled the speculation. Labor unions gained power. The welfare state expanded. The role of government in managing the economy increased dramatically. The debate over Clarence Hatry's true role in the Great Depression continues to this day. Was he the trigger, or merely a symptom? Did he cause the crash, or simply happen to be there when forces beyond his control converged? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Hatry did not create the conditions for the crash. He did not force Americans to buy stocks on margin, or banks to gamble with depositors' money, or the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates at the worst possible moment. but by committing fraud on a massive scale at the exact moment when confidence was most fragile, by shattering the illusion that the financial system was safe and honest, he may have accelerated a crisis that was already inevitable and transformed it into a catastrophe. What is not debatable is the lesson his story teaches us. The lesson that financial systems, no matter how robust they appear, are built on nothing more substantial than confidence. When that confidence breaks, when people stop believing that their banks are safe, that their investments are real, that the people running the system are honest, the collapse can be swift and total. The lesson that leverage magnifies everything, both gains and losses, and that a system built on borrowed money is inherently fragile. The lesson that fraud is never victimless, that the crimes of a desperate man trying to save his empire can ripple outward in ways he never imagined, destroying millions of lives he never met. The Great Depression ended eventually, of course. It took a world war to finally pull the global economy out of its decade-long spiral, but it ended. The stock market recovered, banks were rebuilt, the economy grew again, but the scars lasted for generations. An entire generation that lived through the Depression was marked by it, shaped by it, made cautious and frugal by the memory of standing in bread lines and watching their parents lose everything. And somewhere in the background of all that suffering, all that despair, all those shattered lives and broken dreams, stands the ghost of Clarence Charles Hatry, the silk merchant's son who wanted so badly to belong to the world of high finance that he was willing to forge bonds and duplicate share certificates to keep his empire alive for just a few more months. The man who, in trying to save himself, may have accidentally pushed the world off a cliff. If you found this dive into financial history as fascinating as I did, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events and individuals that shaped our modern world. Because the truth is always stranger and often darker than we imagine.